This term of healthy conflict, we know from decades of research that teams that are able to have conflict, they're able to voice disagreements, express different opinions, push back on one another, have lots of better results, including more innovation, better work outcomes, stronger relationships. That's one that people often just can't wrap their heads around of. They think that conflict will damage relationships when it actually improves them.
Welcome to Changing Conversations, the podcast where we bring you insight on how you can harness the power of conversation to make change happen. My name is Katrina, and I'm here with my colleague Steve. And today we are talking to Amy Gallo. Amy Gallo is a workplace expert who writes and speaks about effective communication, interpersonal dynamics, gender, difficult conversations, and feedback. She is the best-selling author of Getting Along: How to Work with Anyone, Even Difficult People, and the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict, as well as hundreds of articles for the Harvard Business Review. I'm really looking forward to sharing this conversation with you. Enjoy. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We've been looking forward to have this conversation with you, and you've got so much good advice out there through your podcast, through your books and so forth. And I just wanted to start by sort of narrowing the lens on our conversation. It's good for people to know that they can get lots of advice if you're working with a difficult person or getting challenged by that in your workplace. You can find a lot from Amy on that. So go out and look for that. But for our talk, we will focus in on teams and what it means to, have healthy conflict in teams and how your research and work feeds into that. So to get the ball rolling, maybe you can help us understand how healthy conflict can bring us better business results.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a concept that a lot of people really feel quite the opposite, right? When we think about conflict, especially in today's world, given how conflict is portrayed in society, online, in our politics, people think conflict is something you want to avoid at all costs. If you can avoid it, you want to squash it as soon as possible. But this term of healthy conflict, we know from decades of research that teams that are able to have conflict, they're able to voice disagreements, express different opinions, push back on one another, have lots of better results, including more innovation, better work outcomes, stronger relationships. That's one that people often just can't wrap their heads around of. They think that conflict will damage relationships when it actually improves them. And we also know it leads to more inclusive work environments, more inclusive teams, because people, when they don't feel like they have to walk on eggshells, they don't have to hide parts of themselves, swallow their opinions, they tend to feel much more included and welcomed in those teams. So there's so many upsides of healthy conflict. The problem is most of us are too busy trying to avoid it or stifle it that we don't get those benefits.
And how would I start? So if I'm a leader out there and sitting, okay, firstly, interesting thought. I personally do not like conflict at all. So if I were leading a team, I would probably yes, harmony, everybody get on. But then if I'm sitting here hearing that and saying, well, how do I even start with this? What would you say?
Well, I think there's two simple things that you can start with. One is, I just talked about all the upsides of conflict. All those same things are downsides if you flip them, if you don't have conflict, right? Because the opposite of conflict, which is a normal, healthy part of interacting with other humans, the opposite is what Patrick Lencioni, who wrote The 5 Dysfunctions of Teams, calls artificial harmony. And artificial harmony, this idea, I mean, you're both nodding. I assume you have been in teams that have had this, or you recognize it, worked with teams who have it. But it's a sense that we act as if we get along, but in reality, there's all this unspoken ideas, resentments. There's maybe festering conflicts that don't get voiced, a lot of back channel conversations, maybe even some backstabbing happening. And so there's all those downsides. So as a leader, one thing I think you can do is remind yourself that the sort of fake harmony that I'm going for is not good. This is bad for my team. The second thing is just to start saying out loud to your team, we're going to disagree. Debate is a good thing. We want to hear difference of opinions. You may not even believe it when you first say it, but and you're going to have to say it over and over, because most people are like you, Katrina, where they don't like conflict. And so to get them to engage in conflict, you have to hammer it home over and over that this is okay. Not only is it okay, but it's welcomed and valued and will be good for our team.
I think it's a super cool perspective, and I can't help thinking that there's a couple of, you could say, enablers to make that happen that are critical. And from my experience, I mean, if you have a leader who makes the claim that you just exemplified really well, you have to authentically be a person who is invitational to different views and who can hold opposing ideas at the same time without panicking, without feeling this is not good. And I think there's something about authenticity and in that space, and I would say train your ability to or your comfort level with tensions, really, as a human. And when it happens, train your ability to say, this is good, this holds an invitation for us to
stay calm, lean into it.
Yeah, and get more clever. And I just think that from a very, very basic level, I mean, it means that in a team, you need to have a language for how to hold a conversation. As an example, most leadership teams that I work with, there is no language for what is a real conversation or what is a curious conversation. And that means that most leaders intuitively feel that they need to have a perception, an opinion on something. And then you share your opinion. Whereas to get clever, we need to more have a perspective, and we need to a large extent, you could say, explore our individual reasoning. So explore different ways to think about a subject rather than us bouncing perspectives or perceptions rather. And I've just so what's your thinking on this thing? Conversations.
Yeah, I mean, that's just so well said. And I think I have a friend who's a leadership development consultant named Ron Carucci, who says too many leaders think they need to be answer ATMs, right? Like, you go up to the person, you go, here's my problem, here's the input, give me the answer, right? And I think what you're talking about is having more than the answer, but having curiosity, intellectual humility, the ability to say, I don't know, the ability to change your mind. And Katrina, you were alluding to also the need for emotional regulation. So you have to be able to stay calm when someone disagrees with you, when two people on the team start battling out, right? Like, you have to be able to regulate your emotions so that you can sit with the difference or the discord and help the team. Your job in that moment, and I'd be curious how you all think of this when you work with teams, but like your job at the moment is to facilitate a conversation. Not, yes, you want to get to an answer, but you don't get to an answer by declaring it and making it so. I mean, sometimes you have to do that as a leader, but rarely. You more want the team to talk it through, bring in all those perspectives. All that.
But how do you do that when you have say you have a team? I mean, everyone will have a different threshold or different comfort level for tension. So we're talking about an issue, a tension that is a little bit tricky, and there's a lot at stake, maybe even politics involved, and some people will feel, oops, just by the mentioning of it, this is awkward. I'm not ready. I haven't prepared. Others will just feel, yes, let's bring it on. So depending on your childhood and how familiar you are with dysfunctional parents or whatever it is,
your culture and
all
your
of that.
like there's so right.
So how
You
do you
bring
do
all
that?
of that.
Well, so what do you do that?
Yeah.
How do you do that in a team where that threshold is very different?
Well, one thing I think I've seen leaders do really well is to sort of narrate what's happening. So when that tension comes up and you notice some people are, starting to slide under the desk or tense up or look like they're about to, run out of the room, or you can just name it and say, this is an important debate to have. We're fleshing out these different perspectives. It can be really uncomfortable because we're disagreeing. And you know what? We're not used to disagreeing. So I know we all have different perspectives on the value of conflict, but this is an important conversation to have. And I just ask all of you to stay in it.
Okay. I like that.
Just sort of have them. And I actually saw Esther Perel, who's a psychotherapist. She has a podcast and several books. I watched her do a live interview at a conference that I was at, and her guests were having pretty blatant conflict. And she stopped the whole recording and just said to the audience, there are about 1,000 people in the room, and she said, I can feel the tension in the room because we are not used to watching people disagree. And she said, I just want to name that so that everyone who feels maybe a little uncomfortable right now knows why, right? And she made the point, which I think was really helpful, which is we have developed so much technology, so many shortcuts and hacks to make life frictionless for ourselves and for our teams. We want things to be smooth. But that friction is where you get innovation, ideas, forward momentum. So let's reintroduce some of that friction so we can get there. I mean, have you seen teams who've consciously introduced these concepts into their work? Yeah.
And I was actually with a leader a couple of weeks ago in a different context, but we got to talk about this. And she said that for the last year or so, in her management team, all the management meetings they have, and they have one, I think, every second month, and it's normally half day or full day. And for the last year, the modus of that meeting was that they, up towards it, they agreed what are the most pressing tensions that we need to think about and explore together. And then they, of course, prepared a little bit to be able to tee that. I mean, it is a framing of the issue, and that in its own right is an art, because if you frame it less invitational, you also tee up an opinion war. But whereas you tee it up, the tension as a how might we, or we're exploring something here together to get to a better choice than any of us could have done by themselves. When I heard her talk about that, it reminded me of how different that feels compared to most management meetings that I'm part of. And they are very often a very well orchestrated process of corporate theater where every business unit owner will bring something to the table and everyone hopes that the others just stay out of it and says, fine, you run with that. And I mean, really, I mean, is that the level of hope we have for what we can do together? I mean,
I'm sorry I'm laughing, but it's so you've articulated so many times I've seen it where they're like, no questions, awesome, but I'm done. Right. And they think they nailed it because there were no questions.
It went really well. It went really well. We created absolutely nothing together.
But I also think that we are kind of obsessed with solving, and quite recently, I keep returning to that. I don't know if it's actually Einstein, but the thing about spending, 95% of your time on the problem and then going to the solution, because I think that's also the framing, is when we say, okay, we're going to talk about the tensions, and we're also saying, and we're going to stay in the tension for a while. We don't have to solve this right now. And I think it brings a different energy to the conversation. Honestly, I just think we're obsessed with wanting to feel done. Check,
Yes.
fix
Yeah,
that.
the
Okay,
answer.
go do.
Yeah. Well, because we think, I ask leaders all the time, do you work in a high pressure, high paced sector or environment or organization? And no one ever says no,
No.
right? Like no one thinks and that urgency creates this false need to just keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. And I've never thought about it, actually, that Einstein quote, I always thought about it, if it's Einstein, I don't remember who it is, but I've always thought about it the way you said it, that it's about framing. But I think there's an element there too of if you spend 95% of the time talking about the problem, it also means you're sitting with potential solutions for a long time,
Yes.
right? Like because as you're framing the problem, of course you're thinking about solutions, but you're giving yourselves and your colleagues and your collaborators time to process so those solutions might look like before you start to narrow the options.
Yeah, and I think the framing part has this fertile feel where it's actually open in the sense that we are just exploring something here. There's no, the moment you start thinking about the solution,
But it makes me come back to like the beginning of talking about healthy conflict, because the parameters for healthy conflict, I think, are better tuned or more appropriate for being in the exploration of the tension. And it's a different thing, and maybe there is also a healthy conflict on this, but when a decision's been made and then you challenge it, or a decision was made 2 weeks ago and then you challenge it, or a month ago, and suddenly I think the more time that passes, and looking retrospectively to address, a conflict there, I feel like the more time that passes, the more that has the potential to just build up and build up. So this conversation has just made me think about, maybe practicing it in the problem framing phase will help when you're actually needing to learn from what's happening in reality then. Yeah. I don't know how that speaks to you.
Yeah, I mean, very much, because one of the norms that I try to get senior leadership teams that I work with to commit to, among some of the ones we've talked about, right? Conflict is normal and healthy. We say what we mean what we say, right? Which is embedded in what we've talked about, but also is disagree and then commit, right? So disagree when the conversation's happening, that is the time for the disagreement. It's not undermine the decision slowly over time because you never agreed with it. It's not come back 2 weeks later, armed with all of these facts and arguments and I think you mentioned it too, like you have to interrogate the ideas and your assumptions and your perspectives in that moment. It's a co-created process, and that's very deeply uncomfortable for people, but imperative to do if you're going to get those perspectives and let them inform the decisions that you all make too. But then you have to commit. So it may be that, let's say the three of us are working together and I'm an outlier. I'm like, nope, don't think it's a good idea. We interrogate, we do all the work. Once we've made the decision, and maybe you two outvoted me, or maybe I said, okay, fine, let's do it that way. I have to commit. I can't be a drag on the work. I can't undermine it along the way. I really have to be on board at that point.
Can I add to that? I think I like what you're saying, because I sometimes feel that if you are not a very patient person, you need to get to a decision at some point. And someone, with your example, Amy, you need to give in here. We will go with this option. I think at least for me, if I'm forced by majority to go in positive for an option, and I don't buy the reasoning, then I won't do it. If I understand the reasoning, I have no problem going down the example you just mentioned, Amy, about, okay, I understand that you can look at it this way and it makes sense. I would have thought about it differently, but I accept that that's the way to think about it, and you seem to agree, and I'll go with you, which is different than, here's the option we'll go with, and I outright don't agree, and I think your reasoning for getting to it is flawed. And I think that distinction is because I've also seen a lot of examples where CEOs or CXOs are forcing an organization to say, okay, now we just commit and we need to do this, and this is about execution. And the deep understanding and knowing and the deep resolved feeling in the organization is not there. So you can get a shallow commitment, and that'll take you into more problems, I think.
And I think it's on the person. We'll continue the example of us. It's on the person right, as the person who disagrees, it's on me to ask the questions so that I can wrap my head around it. Because I think that's we get into this battle of, you have to explain it to me in a way I understand. And you have to participate in that conversation as well and ask the questions, because it's very possible that you understand the logic and understand the perspective and still disagree with it. And I think that's okay. What you're talking about is having this, it has to make sense, even if it's not something you fully believe. And so I feel like it would be on me to say, okay, explain it to me again. What about this? Are we connecting this dot? And then I do think that there are times where you still have to get on board, even if it's something you don't fully understand or because otherwise the conflict doesn't. I mean, I'm thinking about a team I worked with, and it was the question about hiring, and they were hiring this person, that one person on the team was like, no, I just think this is the wrong person. But they had sort of run out of options. They needed someone in this role. And he could not get on board with the logic, and he agreed to it and still felt uncertain. But it was also then he had to be open to the person being suitable for the role, which he was, to his credit. But if he had been like, still think he's wrong, had to ice that person out when they showed up, had kept voicing that opinion, it could have really ruined the team.
I think it's interesting when you're in that mode, how much is about the desire for control and how much is about, because I think if for the times where we're able to put the collective goal in front of everything, then you can probably give in to lots of different options. It just comes to me that control would be the primary reason why I would be like, absolutely not. We're doing this way.
Or control, and maybe just adding to it trust. So this thing that I can be in situations where I would have done something differently, but the overriding thing in my involvement is that I actually trust the people in the team I'm in. So if you feel that we would go that way and I disagree, it's more important that I trust you and say, okay, just by being who you are, and our legacy as a team makes me back whatever.
This makes me think about something. We were just talking about the state of the world and all the interesting things about that. But I wonder, so what does fear do to So the ideal setup is that we have healthy conflict, that we disagree, we share our different opinions, but there is a higher likelihood right now that due to different circumstances, we are all having a little bit more fear in our systems. So how do we deal with that? And what do you think, Amy?
Well, I think you just named sort of the three biggest enemies of healthy conflict, or things that destroy healthy conflict. And ego, right? The need for control, the need to be right. Distrust, I think, is, also very high. If you don't trust the people, you're not going to engage in, you may not engage in conflict at all, but you definitely won't engage in healthy conflict. And then third, fear, which is connected obviously both to ego and to trust. And that's where the need for psychological safety really comes in, is that how do we create an environment where people don't have to fear, at least in the bubble of the team, they don't have to fear. You might have the cognitive load of larger fears and the risks that you're thinking about for your organization, given current political environment or, pressures that might be put on the organization. That fear might be there, but can you create a space where it's safe to say what's truly on your mind, to say, I don't know, to ask the hard questions. And it's without that, it is really, really
Yes.
hard. I see teams, I'm sure you do too, that don't trust each other. And
Yes.
it's that is the sort of foundation from which you can do this work of having healthy conflict. And there can be proxies, right? If you don't trust one another, maybe you as an individual feel safe because of your position or because of your privilege, but it's a very hard to substitute something for that trust.
I think in this domain, this thing about you don't know what you don't know. I mean, so if you have never been with a team with a high level of trust where you went in and whenever you were together grappling with something, you were creating art, you were creating something that none of you could have done at the same level alone, that feeling of accomplishment together, like, wow, where we took this conversation, this was really unique, we couldn't have done. If you have never had that experience, you have been in a corporate environment, you have defended your turf, you have convinced the world by, performing in your own right, then it's very, very difficult to even voice this. It's very difficult to create a yearning for, wow, we could have a much more curious, courageous conversation between us that would help our business, because you don't know what it is. What do you do, Amy, when you run into leadership teams that have no reference besides, they've heard about a sports team somewhere, who was awesome and blah, blah, but they've never
watched
felt
Ted
it.
Lasso.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you do?
One of the exercises I use, because trust is built over time, right? You're not going to do a 4-hour workshop or even a month-long engagement and create trust. But one of the things is to start getting people to name what they experience. And you mentioned earlier to the teams that talk about the tensions, right? The framing of the problem. That exercise I try to get. So I'll give them some examples of common tensions that teams experience, right? Speed versus quality, focus on what's best for the company versus what's best for the client, revenue versus purpose, right? Try to sort of articulate what some of the common tensions are, and then get them to name some of the tensions that they're experiencing.
Yes.
Because once they start voicing out loud, it helps. It becomes less about Amy versus Katrina, and then it's more about this bigger issue. And that, for me, sort of gives that space in which they can at least start to say, like, yeah, my team cares about quality because of this and this and this. And, we got dinged by the CEO last year because we didn't do that. And this team is saying, well, you don't understand the pressure we're under to move fast. And so it starts to create, it sort of opens up the tent, right? Gives this framing so people can start having those questions. One of the other things I've done with teams is just a very basic, like, create a user guide to you, because when there's distrust, there's a lot of misinterpretation about behavior.
Yes.
Amy shows up to the meeting and doesn't talk because she doesn't respect us, right? Rather than the fact, well, maybe Amy's afraid because of this and this, or maybe Amy's shy, or maybe Amy's processing and she has to come back later. So creating a user guide to yourself, and usually I tell people it has to be 1 page, and it's just a description of how do you think of yourself? Introvert, extrovert? How do you communicate? What are things people might misinterpret about your behavior or about what you say?
Yes.
What are your values? Things that really help others get a sense of who you are. Have you ever done something similar with teams?
Yeah, and I think building on that, kind of really getting to know each other.
And yourself.
Sort of space, and yourself, I suppose, as well. I think we also, often talk about the value of, you meet up for meetings in the day, but actually having dinner together or an evening where you sit, by either physical or metaphorical fireplace and like actually sharing something about yourself. Because I think when you humanize, when I realized that, okay, Steve, you're a person, you have a family at home, you like doing things, and I like that too. Or, you have something that humanizes them, so that in that moment where you've said something that I completely disagree with, you can kind of fall back on, okay, but he seems like a kind of decent person. So what could he see in this that I can't see myself? So yeah, I think definitely working with it in that kind of way.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we give people the benefit of the doubt when we know them better,
Yeah.
right? We know that we're much more open-minded. I mean, there's the fundamental attribution error, that social psychology concept of if we show up to a meeting and Steve comes in late and I think, oh, so disrespectful, disorganized, what I come up with all these reasons that have to do with his personality about why he showed up late. I show up late, and in my head, I'm like, well, there was traffic, and I had that other meeting I had. We externalize our reasons for negative behavior, and we internalize other
Yeah.
people's.
Yeah.
And when we have the context, the shared context or shared understanding, then we're much more open to, all right, Steve has 3 kids at home, and they're always, I remember him talking about how it's hard to get them out the door for school, or, you start making the external attributions as opposed to the internal ones.
So we don't have a load more time. I just wanted to touch on one thing before we also head to the end of this recording. And that is, now we've been talking about others and people in teams and all the good ideas around that. And I thought it could be interesting to hear about you guys and the way that you've pushed your boundaries when it comes to these topics we've just been talking about, because I think it brings it home into a different grounding. And I'll just start by sharing one experience that I had, because having heard all these nice theoretical things about what should work, I invited for a meeting in a project team that was called Surfacing the Tensions, heart emoji. Just beginning to try to acknowledge my discomfort already at that point. And then I said, yep, so this is a session where we get to talk about how the different tensions we're experiencing and so forth. And I hated that meeting so much. It was
Sounds awful.
It was the right thing to do. But I realized while I was in it that I wanted the resolution of what we were talking about in the moment of having that conversation. But that resolution isn't going to come because these are big problems that we were discussing. So I wanted to share that as an example of somewhere where I've pushed myself to try something and that I think it kind of worked, but I learned some stuff. But I'd be curious to hear, what have you tried that kind of pushed yourself out of your comfort zone in bringing this kind of healthy conflict into play?
I can think of 2 things, and they might not be as contextual precise as yours, but for me, in the meetings that I somewhat is responsible for, I have this sentence brewing all the time. That is, what is the conversation we're not having? What's the conversation we should have? What's the courageous next conversation so just to give me a little more faith in making the invitation, or being a little more courageous as to actually be vulnerable and maybe take a stab at shaping it. That's the one thing. And then at the same time acknowledging that everyone will have a different perspective on that. So how can I, in one hand, have the courage and potentially also the ability to frame a real issue, a conversation we need to have, but hold it very, very lightly and invitational for other people to nuance it, to help frame it better than I can do alone, because you have a different perspective. You may have a more granular view on something. So both the courage to say it and frame it, but then also letting go of being too much in love with my own perspective.
Your idea of that.
That happens on good days.
Oh, very nice.
Good moments. Good moments, rather.
Yeah.
How about you?
I definitely, my edge is that my learning edge is that I think I'm right all the time. And I really, and I have the archetype in my book, Getting Along, of the know-it-all, and I identify with it so much. And I really have to watch when I feel this. I can feel it in my like chest. My chest gets very like solid and like sort of pushed forward of like, nope, I'm right. Like, you know, and I really have to watch that. And then I ask myself, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm completely wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And just have the thought exercise, not of the ego loss and all of that, but the thought exercise of, well, what would it mean to this conversation if I was completely wrong? And gives me, just sort of broadens my perspective, softens my shoulders a little, and lets me listen better, because then I have to learn. And sometimes I find myself going, nope, I'm right. I'm right back there. So I have to work on that. The other thing, and this was a lesson I learned. I had a really hard conversation, this was a few years ago, with someone on a team where I had to give them some feedback, that the team sort of nominated me to give them feedback that they had said something that was offensive in a meeting. And you would think, as someone who writes and talks about difficult conversations and conflict, that I'm perfectly comfortable with them, but that's not true. I still have my own hesitations. I'm still human, right? And so it took me a good 24 hours of working myself up for this conversation, planning it, planning out what I would say. And she had a terrible reaction. She was like, you're absolutely wrong. That is not true. That's not what I said. That's not what I meant. I don't think anyone else interpreted it that way. And it just sort of blew up in my face. And then I went back the next day, tried to have the conversation again. It went a little bit better, but it was still, I would declare it a disaster. And 3 months later, we sort of just moved on. I was like, all right, I gave the feedback. What can I do? 3 months later, I heard from another colleague that colleague had gone to her and said, oh, Amy really gave me this really important feedback a few months ago. It really helped. It changed the way I saw things. Mm-hmm. And it was such a good reminder that difficult conversations are not measured by how smooth or comfortable they feel, and they're not even measured by that moment or even that week, but really the long-term goal. And sometimes you'll just have to be patient and and sit with the discomfort, right? Our relationship was not great for a while. And I wanted to do everything to smooth it over and to say, you know what, you're right. We knew you didn't mean, but I had to sort of stick with my values, stick with what I had promised the rest of the team I would do, and then wait. And we did get right back. I didn't ever say anything to her about it. I didn't want to be like, but it's funny. My know-it-allness could have been like, see, I was right. I know, I'm right. But instead I had to just sort of sit with it. And then we got back into a good rhythm. Eventually it took another few months after that, which was a long time to wait, but it was, so that's a big one for me, is just the patience of waiting for the result of the conversation.
I love that. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And I think now is the right time to sort of round off, and we always round off by asking, what is it that we are going to take out of this conversation into the next one, based on the different things we've been talking about. So Steve, what comes to mind for you?
It was something you mentioned, Amy. I don't know if I'm using the right word, but this thing about when you're in that conversation and you're trying to move the conversation somewhere and get to a, whatever you call it, conflict, or we're talking about an issue that we're grappling with. This idea about, in the conversation, naming what is actually happening right now. I think that's something that I very rarely do. and I think I'm victim of being quite comfortable even when the tension is quite high, and acknowledging that there will be other people in the room that might have a different threshold for tension comfort, and the naming of it somehow offers, you could say, a balcony perspective where you can stay in the conflict, but you're also getting a balcony perspective on what's happening. I think that can ease our nervous systems a little bit so that we can stay longer. So I thank you for that, Amy.
I think maybe I can also just follow on by saying the thing that is going to stick with me is this thing that you said at the end, but I think it's a common theme throughout, that don't measure the success of I guess what you're intending to do by how it felt in the moment, and actually giving it time. So trying to stay grounded, trying to stay in the tension. It's okay if it doesn't feel great, but then see what happens and actually do your measurement piece a little after. So that's really helpful for me.
What about you, Amy? What sits in you?
Yeah. Well, Steve, it's a question you asked, Steve, around the around when you really fundamentally disagree with a decision that's being made and you feel forced to do it. How do you sit with that? How do you and you know, I shared the sort of disagree and then commit, and I think I agree that's a good team norm. It's just hard to do personally. And so I think one of the things I'll continue to reflect on from this conversation is what's required in that moment when you really disagree with a decision that's being made. What's required of you to be able to continue to be part of the team, a productive part of the team, and continue to push the idea forward? And what do you need to do internally and externally to make that okay?
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure having this conversation with the both of you. How did this conversation resonate with you? Get in touch via the link in the show notes to share your questions, challenges, and opinions. And until next time, take care.